January 2nd, 1967. 15,000 feet above the jungles of North Vietnam. Through his canopy, Colonel Robin Olds watched 7 flights of American fighters streak toward Hanoi, each one carrying enough firepower to level a city block. To Vietnamese radar operators below, they looked exactly like the slow, bomb-laden thunder chiefs that had been easy prey for months. Same flight paths, same altitudes, same electronic signatures. The Vietnamese Air Force scrambled their best, 12 MiG-21 interceptors climbing fast through the clouds, their pilots confident they were about to shred another helpless American bombing mission. But these weren't bombers. Hidden beneath external fuel tanks that would soon be jettisoned, each aircraft bristled with air-to-air missiles. The most experienced fighter pilots in Southeast Asia, flying the most advanced interceptors in the world, disguised as sitting ducks. Vietnamese ground controllers were vectoring their pilots toward what they believed was certain victory. Instead, they had just ordered them into the most devastating aerial ambush in the history of the Vietnam War. One pilot's deception was about to turn an entire Air Force's greatest strength into their fatal weakness. Subscribe for more incredible war stories that changed history. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the concrete ramp at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base as Colonel Robin Olds walked the flight line, his boots clicking against the hot tarmac. It was November 26, 1966, barely 2 months since he had taken command of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, and already the statistics painted a grim picture. His F-105 Thunder Chiefs, the workhorses of the Rolling Thunder bombing campaign, were coming home with jettisoned ordnance more often than not, empty pylons where 750-pound bombs should have been. Fuel tanks dropped over the jungle instead of delivered to target. Mission after mission aborted because MiG-21 interceptors had forced his pilots to dump their loads and run for home. Olds paused beside a battle-damaged Thud, its aluminum skin peppered with holes from ground fire. The crew chief looked up from his inspection, shaking his head. "Colonel, this bird took a beating up north today. 3rd time this month we've had to patch her up after a MiG encounter." The young sergeant's frustration was evident in every word. These weren't cowards flying these missions. They were some of the best pilots in the Air Force, veterans who had trained for years to deliver ordnance on target. But the Vietnamese People's Air Force had turned the tables on them, and everyone on the base knew it. The problem had become maddeningly predictable. American strike packages would form up over Thailand, heavy with bombs and external fuel tanks, cruising at 450 knots toward targets around Hanoi. The F-105s, designed as nuclear delivery aircraft, had been pressed into conventional bombing roles they were never meant to perform. Loaded down with 6,000 pounds of ordnance, they flew like freight trains, fast in a straight line, but vulnerable to the slashing attacks that had become the MiG-21's signature tactic. Vietnamese ground control intercept stations would vector their fighters into position, using the Americans' own predictability against them. The MiGs would climb to altitude, build up speed, then dive through the bomber formations in hit-and-run attacks that forced the Thuds to jettison their loads and fight for their lives. Captain John Stone knocked on the doorframe of Olds' office that evening, carrying a manila folder thick with intelligence reports and tactical analyses. Stone had earned his reputation as the wing's sharpest tactical mind, a pilot who could see patterns others missed and translate combat experience into actionable doctrine. His face carried the weight of too many debriefings with frustrated aircrew, too many mission reports that read like exercises in futility. "Sir, we need to talk about the MiG problem. It's not getting better. It's getting worse." Olds gestured to the chair across from his desk, already knowing what Stone was going to tell him. The intelligence reports confirmed what every pilot in the wing felt in their gut. The Vietnamese Air Force was learning faster than the Americans were adapting. Each successful MiG attack taught them more about American tactics, timing, and vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing was locked into a predictable pattern of operations that played directly into enemy hands. The very consistency that made large-scale bombing campaigns possible, standard routes, standard altitudes, standard formations, had become a liability that cost American lives and mission effectiveness. Stone spread reconnaissance photographs across the desk, pointing to images of Phuc Yen airfield 30 kilometers north of Hanoi. "Sir, they've got at least 12 MiG-21s operational at any given time, Soviet-built, ground control intercept capable, and their pilots are getting better every month. They know our ingress routes, our typical altitudes, our formation patterns. They scramble when our packages cross the border, climb to altitude, and wait for us to come to them. Then, they dive through our formations at Mach 1.5, fire their heat-seeking missiles, and disappear before our escort fighters can engage." The tactical situation represented everything Olds had learned to hate about predictable warfare. In World War II, he had earned his reputation by thinking 3 moves ahead of the enemy, by breaking patterns that had become too comfortable, too routine. Now he found himself commanding a wing trapped in operational habits that the enemy had learned to exploit with devastating effectiveness. Every successful MiG attack validated their approach and encouraged more of the same. Something had to change, and it had to change soon. Olds studied the photographs in silence, his mind already working through possibilities. The F-4 Phantom, with its twin engines and advanced radar, could outfight a MiG-21 in sustained combat. But the Vietnamese pilots were too smart to engage in sustained combat. They used their speed advantage and ground control guidance to pick their spots, attacking when conditions favored them, and disappearing when they didn't. The key was finding a way to force them into a fight on American terms, in a situation where the Phantom's advantages in endurance and missile capability could be brought to bear. What if we could make them think they were attacking thuds when they were really engaging Phantoms? Olds asked, his voice quiet with the kind of dangerous thinking that had made him legendary among fighter pilots. Stone looked up from the photographs, immediately understanding the implications. It would mean abandoning the conventional escort mission profile that had governed American fighter operations since the beginning of the bombing campaign. It would mean deliberately deceiving not just the enemy, but potentially their own side about the true nature of a mission. Most importantly, it would mean turning the enemy's tactical success against them. The idea crystallized as they talked through the operational requirements. Vietnamese ground controllers expected F-105 formations to follow predictable patterns because that's what F-105 formations had always done. They scrambled MiGs based on those expectations, positioning their fighters for optimal attack runs against bomb-laden aircraft that couldn't maneuver effectively. But what if those formations were actually F-4 Phantoms disguised as thuds, carrying air-to-air missiles instead of bombs, ready to fight instead of run? The MiGs would climb to attack position and find themselves facing the most capable air superiority fighters in the American inventory, flown by pilots who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. As the evening wore on and the details took shape, both men realized they were discussing something that went far beyond tactical innovation. They were talking about fundamentally changing the nature of the air war over North Vietnam, about turning the enemy's greatest strength into their greatest vulnerability. The Vietnamese Air Force had succeeded by learning American patterns and exploiting them. Now those same patterns would become the bait for a trap that could devastate their most effective fighter regiment. The game the MiGs had been winning was about to change, and they wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. The operations room at Ubon buzzed with quiet intensity as December melted into the final days of 1966. Captain Stone had assembled a tight circle of pilots and intelligence officers, each sworn to absolute secrecy about what would soon become the most audacious deception operation of the Vietnam War. First Lieutenant Joseph Hicks bent over navigation charts, calculating fuel consumption rates and ingress timing down to the minute. First Lieutenant Ralph Wetterhahn studied electronic warfare reports, identifying the precise radio frequencies and radar signatures that would make the ruse believable. Major James Covington coordinated with maintenance crews, ensuring every aircraft selected for the mission would be mission-ready when the moment came. The technical requirements for the deception were staggering in their complexity. Each F-4 Phantom would need to carry QRC-160 electronic countermeasure pods, normally reserved for F-105 operations. These pods would transmit the same electronic signatures that Vietnamese radar operators had learned to associate with incoming Thunderchief formations. The pods were bulky, reducing fuel capacity and missile loadout, but without them, the deception would collapse the moment Vietnamese ground control intercept stations detected the incoming flights. Stone had calculated that each Phantom could carry 4 AIM-7 Sparrow radar-guided missiles and 2 AIM-9 Sidewinder heat seekers, while still maintaining the electronic profile of a bomb-laden thud. The mission planning session stretched deep into the night as Olds refined every detail of what they were calling Operation Bolo. 7 flights of F-4 Phantoms from the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing would depart Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base, following exactly the same routes, altitudes, and timing that F-105 strike packages had used for months. They would maintain radio silence using Thunderchief call signs and procedures. Their formation spacing would mirror typical bomber formations. Most critically, they would cruise at 450 knots at 15,000 feet, the same predictable profile that had made the real thuds such attractive targets for MiG attacks. The eastern component of the trap required coordination with the 366th Tactical Fighter Wing at Da Nang Air Base in South Vietnam. Colonel Olds had quietly arranged for additional Phantom flights to position themselves near alternate airfields that the MiGs might use for emergency landings or escape routes toward China. These aircraft would remain at high altitude, invisible to Vietnamese radar until the moment they were needed to close potential escape routes. The timing had to be perfect. If the eastern force appeared too early, Vietnamese controllers would recognize the trap and keep their MiGs on the ground. Fuel calculations dominated every aspect of the planning. Stone and his team had studied captured intelligence reports about MiG-21 operational procedures, learning that the Soviet-built interceptors typically carried enough fuel for 55 minutes of flight time under combat conditions. This narrow fuel margin was both the MiG's greatest tactical limitation and the key to Operation Bolo's success. If Vietnamese controllers scrambled their fighters expecting a quick hit-and-run attack against slow bombers, they would commit their aircraft to a fuel profile that assumed rapid engagement and immediate return to base. But if those bombers turned out to be fighters ready for extended air-to-air combat, the MiGs would find themselves trapped by their own fuel limitations. The spacing between incoming Phantom flights became a crucial element of the deception. Each flight would arrive over the target area exactly 5 minutes after the previous one, creating a continuous stream of apparent targets that would force Vietnamese controllers to keep their MiGs airborne longer than planned. Stone had calculated that by the time the 4th or 5th Phantom flight appeared, any MiGs launched against the first flight would be approaching critical fuel levels. They would have to choose between pressing attacks against what they thought were defenseless bombers or returning to base to refuel, a decision that would be made for them once the shooting started. Weather reconnaissance reports indicated that January 2nd would bring heavy cloud cover over the target area, with a solid overcast layer extending from 5,000 to 10,000 feet above the Red River Valley. Olds saw the clouds as an advantage rather than an obstacle. Vietnamese pilots climbing through the overcast to intercept altitude would break through into clear air, expecting to find F-105 formations in their typical bombing profile. Instead, they would emerge into a carefully orchestrated ambush by some of the most experienced fighter pilots in Southeast Asia, flying aircraft optimized for air-to-air combat. The maintenance requirements for Operation Bolo pushed Ubon's ground crews to their limits. Every Phantom selected for the mission underwent complete pre-flight inspection, with particular attention to radar systems, missile guidance equipment, and electronic countermeasure pods. Olds had ordered that no aircraft with even minor mechanical discrepancies would participate in the operation. The margin for error was too small to risk equipment failures at the critical moment. Weapons specialists loaded each aircraft with a carefully calculated mix of AIM-7 and AIM-9 missiles, balancing long-range radar-guided capability with short-range heat-seeking backup systems. The psychological preparation proved as important as the technical details. Olds gathered his selected pilots in a secure briefing room, emphasizing that success depended not just on individual flying skill, but on collective discipline in maintaining the deception until the last possible moment. Each pilot would have to resist the natural fighter-pilot instinct to maneuver aggressively or climb to optimal fighting altitude until Vietnamese MiGs were committed to their attack runs. The Phantoms would have to look and act like vulnerable bombers right up to the moment they shed their external fuel tanks and revealed their true nature. Radio procedures became another layer of the deception that required weeks of practice. Phantom crews would use Thunder Chief call signs and communication protocols, maintaining the fiction even during combat if possible. Vietnamese intelligence services had studied American radio procedures extensively, learning to distinguish between bomber formations and fighter escorts based on communication patterns and terminology. Any deviation from established F-105 procedures might alert Vietnamese controllers to the true nature of the incoming flights. As January 1st turned into January 2nd, final weather reports confirmed that conditions were optimal for the operation. The monsoon season had brought the predicted cloud cover, and intelligence indicated that Vietnamese MiG units were maintaining normal alert status, with no sign that they suspected anything unusual about the incoming mission profile. Olds walked the flight line one final time, checking with crew chiefs and weapons specialists, ensuring that every detail was perfect. In less than 12 hours, the most successful aerial ambush in the history of air warfare would prove whether months of planning and preparation could overcome an enemy that had learned to exploit American predictability with devastating effectiveness. At 1300 hours local time on January 2, 1967, the first flight of F-4 Phantoms lifted off from Ubon's runway with Colonel Robin Olds at the controls of the lead aircraft. The 7 flights departed at precise 5-minute intervals, their twin-engine afterburners cutting through the humid Thai air as they climbed toward their deception altitude. Each Phantom carried the electronic countermeasure pods that would make them appear identical to F-105 formations on Vietnamese radar screens, but hidden beneath external fuel tanks were the AIM-7 Sparrows and AIM-9 Sidewinders that would turn this apparent bombing mission into the deadliest fighter sweep of the war. The flights maintained perfect formation discipline as they crossed into Laotian airspace, following the same ingress routes that Thunder Chief bombers had used for months. Olds held his Phantom at exactly 450 knots indicated airspeed, fighting every fighter pilot instinct that screamed at him to climb higher and faster. The success of Operation Bolo depended on Vietnamese ground controllers believing they were vectoring their MiGs against another predictable American bombing mission. Any deviation from established F-105 flight profiles would compromise the entire operation. Radio intercepts confirmed that Vietnamese radar operators had detected the incoming formations and classified them as hostile strike packages inbound toward the Hanoi area. At Phuoc Yen Airfield, 30 kilometers north of the North Vietnamese capital, ground crews scrambled to prepare MiG-21 interceptors of the 921st Fighter Regiment. The Soviet-built fighters began their engine start procedures, their pilots confident they were about to repeat the successful hit-and-run attacks that had forced so many American bombers to jettison their ordnance over the past months. As the Phantom formations approached the Red River Valley, thick clouds stretched from 5,000 feet up to nearly 10,000 feet, creating a grey ceiling that would work to the Americans' advantage. Vietnamese pilots climbing through the overcast would emerge into clear air, expecting to find slow, heavily loaded bombers in their predictable formations. Instead, they would face fighters that had been waiting months for exactly this opportunity. Olds checked his missile switches one final time, ensuring that his AIM-9 Sidewinders were armed and ready for the moment the deception would be revealed. The first MiGs broke through the cloud layer at 14:55 hours, climbing fast toward what their ground controllers had told them was another formation of vulnerable F-105s. Lieutenant Nguyen Van Kock, flying with the 921st Fighter Regiment, led his flight through the overcast, expecting to execute the same slashing attack that had proven so effective against American bombers. The MiG-21s had built their reputation on speed and surprise, diving through bomber formations too quickly for escort fighters to engage effectively. Olds watched the first MiG emerge from the clouds ahead and below his formation, exactly where intelligence had predicted they would appear. The Vietnamese pilot was climbing toward intercept position, unaware that he was approaching fighters rather than bombers. The colonel's hands moved to his external fuel tank jettison switches, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether months of planning would pay off or whether Operation Bolo would become another failed experiment in tactical innovation. The moment the lead MiG committed to its attack run, Olds triggered his tank jettison system and lit his afterburners simultaneously. The external fuel tanks fell away as his Phantom leapt forward with the sudden acceleration that only an unloaded fighter could achieve. Around him, the other 6 flights executed the same maneuver in perfect synchronization, shedding the disguise that had brought them within missile range of their targets. What had appeared to be 7 formations of bomb-laden thuds suddenly revealed itself as 28 of the most advanced air superiority fighters in the world. The lead MiG pilot realized his mistake in the split second before Olds' first AIM-9 Sidewinder left its rail. The heat-seeking missile tracked perfectly on the MiG's jet exhaust, covering the distance between aircraft in less than 3 seconds. The warhead detonation sent debris spinning through the air as the Vietnamese fighter began its final dive toward the jungle below. Olds was already maneuvering for a second shot when his wingman called out additional MiGs climbing through the clouds. Captain Stone's flight engaged 3 MiGs that had climbed to altitude expecting easy targets, but found themselves facing experienced American fighter pilots with every tactical advantage. The Vietnamese pilots tried to execute their standard hit-and-run tactics, but the Phantoms matched their speed and maneuverability while bringing superior missile systems to bear. Stone fired 2 AIM-7 Sparrows at a MiG attempting to dive away from the engagement, both missiles guiding perfectly to their target. The radio channels filled with position calls and engagement reports as the ambush unfolded exactly as planned. Vietnamese ground controllers, realizing they had been deceived, began vectoring additional MiGs toward the fight, but their aircraft were now facing a prepared enemy that had chosen the time and place of engagement. The fuel calculations that Stone had worked out during the planning phase were proving devastatingly accurate. MiGs that had scrambled expecting quick attacks against bombers were now trapped in extended air-to-air combat with insufficient fuel to disengage safely. Major Covington's flight caught 2 MiGs attempting to escape toward Chinese airspace, their pilots probably realizing that they had been lured into a carefully planned trap. The Phantom's superior endurance allowed them to pursue the fleeing interceptors while maintaining enough fuel for the return flight to Thailand. Covington fired his remaining AIM-9 at long range, watching the missile track true as the Vietnamese pilot attempted evasive maneuvers that only hastened his fuel consumption. The engagement lasted exactly 12 minutes from first missile launch to the final MiG falling toward the jungle floor. American claims would eventually total 7 MiG-21s destroyed, with no losses to the attacking force, though North Vietnamese records would acknowledge only 5 aircraft lost. The discrepancy mattered less than the tactical reality that Operation Bolo had achieved. The most successful MiG regiment in the Vietnamese People's Air Force had been devastated by an enemy they thought they understood completely. As the Phantom flights turned south toward their refueling tankers, Olds allowed himself a moment of satisfaction at what his wing had accomplished. The predictable patterns that had made American bombing missions vulnerable to MiG attacks had become the bait for an ambush that exploited the enemy's tactical success against them. The Vietnamese Air Force had learned to defeat American bombers by studying their habits and exploiting their limitations. Now those same habits had delivered their best pilots into a trap that turned every tactical advantage against them. The air war over North Vietnam would never be the same. The silence that fell over Phuoc Yen airfield in the hours following Operation Bolo carried a weight that every pilot and ground crew member could feel in their bones. 5 MiG-21s that had taken off expecting routine intercept missions would never return to their hardened shelters. The 921st Fighter Regiment, which had built its reputation on the predictable nature of American bombing operations, suddenly found itself facing an enemy that had turned that very predictability into a weapon of devastating effectiveness. Squadron commanders gathered in emergency session, their voices hushed as they tried to comprehend how their most successful tactical approach had been so completely reversed against them. Lieutenant Nguyen Van Kok sat in the debriefing room at Phuc Yen, his flight suit still damp with perspiration from his emergency ejection over the Red River Valley. The young pilot, who would later become North Vietnam's highest-scoring ace, had survived the ambush, but the experience had shaken his confidence in everything the Vietnamese People's Air Force thought it knew about American fighter tactics. His debriefing officers pressed him for details about the engagement, struggling to understand how formations that had appeared identical to previous F-105 strikes had suddenly transformed into the most lethal air-to-air trap of the war. Kok's description of external fuel tanks falling away to reveal missile-armed phantoms sounded almost impossible to the intelligence officers taking notes. The psychological impact of the defeat rippled through every level of the Vietnamese Air Force command structure. For months, MiG pilots had approached American bombing formations with the confidence that came from tactical success and thorough understanding of enemy procedures. The hit-and-run attacks against F-105 formations had become almost routine, with Vietnamese pilots knowing exactly when to climb, when to attack, and when to disengage before American escort fighters could respond effectively. Operation Bolo had shattered that confidence by proving that the Americans could adapt their tactics in ways that turned apparent vulnerability into overwhelming strength. General Phung Tha Thai, commander of the Vietnamese People's Air Force, ordered an immediate stand-down of all MiG operations, pending a complete tactical review. The decision meant that for the first time since early 1966, American bombing missions would fly over North Vietnam without facing the MiG-21 threat that had forced so many aircraft to jettison their ordnance. The grounding order acknowledged what every pilot already knew. Their previous tactical approach had been completely compromised by an enemy that had learned to think several moves ahead of their established patterns. At Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base, Colonel Olds walked among the phantoms that had returned from Operation Bolo, their missile rails empty, and their pilots exhausted but triumphant. Ground crews clustered around each aircraft, counting the small victory symbols that would be painted on the nose cones to commemorate confirmed kills. The mood was one of professional satisfaction rather than celebration. These were veteran airmen who understood that tactical success in air-to-air combat came from preparation, planning, and execution rather than luck or individual heroics. Captain Stone found himself surrounded by intelligence officers, eager to document every aspect of the mission for analysis and potential replication. The tactical innovation that had made Operation Bolo possible represented more than a successful engagement. It demonstrated that the American air campaign could adapt and evolve in response to enemy countermeasures. Stone's detailed mission reports would become required reading at fighter weapons schools, studied by pilots and planners looking for ways to apply similar deception techniques to other tactical situations. The strategic implications of Operation Bolo extended far beyond the immediate loss of aircraft and pilots. Vietnamese air defense planners realized that their ground-controlled intercept procedures, which had been so effective against predictable American formations, were now a potential liability that could be exploited by an enemy willing to sacrifice operational simplicity for tactical surprise. Every radar contact would now require careful analysis to determine whether incoming formations were actually what they appeared to be, slowing response times and creating uncertainty that would persist for months. Major Covington's flight debriefing revealed the fuel calculations that had made the ambush so devastatingly effective. The MiG-21s that had scrambled expecting quick intercept missions found themselves committed to extended air-to-air combat with insufficient fuel reserves for effective maneuvering or safe disengagement. Several Vietnamese pilots had been forced to eject not because of combat damage, but because their aircraft had reached critical fuel states while still engaged with American fighters. The lesson was clear: tactical success based on predictable enemy behavior could become a fatal weakness when that enemy learned to use predictability as camouflage. The human cost of the engagement weighed heavily on both sides, despite the absence of American casualties. Olds reflected on the irony that victory had come not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through the kind of tactical thinking that turned the enemy's strengths against them. The Vietnamese pilots who had died or been forced to eject were skilled aviators who had been outmaneuvered rather than outfought, victims of a deception that exploited their training and experience against them. War had always rewarded adaptability over rigid adherence to doctrine, and Operation Bolo had proven that lesson with deadly clarity. 4 days later, Olds would demonstrate that the success of Operation Bolo was not a fluke, but the beginning of a new approach to air-to-air warfare over North Vietnam. On January 6th, F-4 Phantoms, disguised as RF-4, reconnaissance aircraft executed another successful ambush, confirming that American fighter pilots had learned to think beyond the tactical limitations that had made their missions predictable. The Vietnamese Air Force would eventually adapt to these new realities, but the period of tactical dominance that had characterized their MiG operations through 1966 was permanently broken. The victory at Phuoc Yen became a turning point that extended beyond individual missions or tactical innovations. It proved that the air war over North Vietnam was ultimately a contest of ideas rather than equipment, where success belonged to the side that could most effectively anticipate and counter the enemy's adaptive responses. The Vietnamese People's Air Force had learned to exploit American predictability with devastating effectiveness. But Operation Bolo had shown that predictability itself could become a weapon when wielded by commanders willing to think beyond conventional approaches to fighter operations. As Olds stood on the U-Bon flight line watching his ground crews prepare aircraft for the next day's missions, he understood that Operation Bolo represented both an ending and a beginning. The tactical stalemate that had characterized air-to-air combat over North Vietnam was broken, but the enemy would learn from their defeat just as the Americans had learned from their earlier frustrations. The war would continue to evolve, demanding constant adaptation from both sides, but for now, the initiative belonged to the pilots and planners, who had proven that even the most successful enemy tactics contained the seeds of their own defeat. The aftermath of Operation Bolo rippled through the tactical doctrine of both air forces with consequences that would reshape the air war over Southeast Asia for the remainder of the conflict. Colonel Olds understood that his wing's success had created both opportunity and obligation. The Vietnamese People's Air Force would inevitably adapt to counter the deception techniques that had proven so effective on January 2nd, and the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing would need to stay ahead of that adaptation or risk losing the initiative they had gained through months of careful planning and flawless execution. 4 days after the Phuoc Yen ambush, Olds proved that Operation Bolo was not an isolated tactical innovation, but the beginning of a new approach to air superiority operations. On January 6th, his planners developed another deception mission using F-4 Phantoms disguised as RF-4 reconnaissance aircraft. The photo reconnaissance missions had become routine over North Vietnam, typically flying predictable routes at medium altitude with minimal escort protection. Vietnamese controllers had learned to ignore these flights as non-threatening, focusing their limited MiG resources on the bomber formations that represented immediate threats to critical targets around Hanoi. The reconnaissance ruse followed the same principles that had made Operation Bolo so devastatingly effective. American fighters would adopt the electronic signatures, flight profiles, and communication procedures of aircraft that the enemy had learned to ignore or engage with minimal force. When Vietnamese MiGs scrambled to investigate what appeared to be a routine photo mission, they would instead encounter missile-armed Phantoms flown by pilots who had studied every aspect of MiG tactics and capabilities. The second ambush confirmed that the tactical revolution begun 4 days earlier was not dependent on surprise alone, but represented a fundamental shift in how American fighter pilots approached air-to-air warfare. The strategic implications extended far beyond individual mission success rates. For the first time since the beginning of the Rolling Thunder bombing campaign, American strike packages could approach their targets without the constant threat of MiG-21 intercepts that had forced so many formations to jettison their ordnance. The grounding of Vietnamese fighter operations created a window of tactical opportunity that allowed bombers to reach targets that had been effectively protected by the threat of air-to-air intercept. The psychological effect on both air forces was immediate and profound. American aircrews approached their missions with renewed confidence, while Vietnamese pilots struggled to develop new tactics that could counter an enemy that had learned to use deception as effectively as they had once used predictability. Captain Stone found himself at the center of a tactical revolution that reached far beyond the boundaries of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing. Fighter weapons schools throughout the Air Force began incorporating the lessons of Operation Bolo into their curricula, teaching young pilots that air superiority depended as much on tactical thinking as on flying skill or equipment capability. The principle of using enemy expectations against them became a cornerstone of advanced fighter tactics, with instructors emphasizing that the most successful ambushes came from understanding how the enemy thought rather than simply flying faster or carrying better missiles. The Vietnamese response to Operation Bolo revealed both the strengths and limitations of their air defense system. General Phung Thai's decision to ground MiG operations pending tactical review demonstrated the kind of careful analysis that had made the Vietnamese People's Air Force so effective during the early months of the bombing campaign. But the extended stand-down also highlighted their dependence on a relatively small number of experienced pilots and aircraft, a limitation that made catastrophic losses like those suffered on January 2nd particularly difficult to absorb. The 921st Fighter Regiment would eventually return to combat operations, but with new procedures that acknowledged the reality of American tactical adaptation. Lieutenant Nguyen Van Coc's survival and eventual rise to become North Vietnam's highest-scoring MiG ace illustrated the resilience and adaptability that characterized both air forces during this period of tactical evolution. The young pilot who had ejected over the Red River Valley during Operation Bolo learned from his experience in ways that made him a more dangerous adversary. His later victories against American aircraft would come from applying many of the same principles that had made Operation Bolo successful: careful study of enemy patterns, exploitation of tactical assumptions, and the kind of innovative thinking that turned apparent disadvantages into combat advantages. The broader lessons of Operation Bolo resonated throughout the American military establishment as evidence that tactical innovation could achieve results that superior numbers or technology alone could not guarantee. The mission demonstrated that air superiority was ultimately a contest of ideas, where success belonged to the side that could most effectively anticipate and counter enemy adaptive responses. This principle would influence American fighter doctrine for decades, emphasizing the importance of intellectual flexibility and tactical creativity over rigid adherence to established procedures. Olds recognized that his wing's tactical success carried responsibilities that extended beyond their immediate operational environment. The techniques that had made Operation Bolo possible needed to be documented, taught, and refined for use by other units facing similar tactical challenges. He worked closely with Air Force intelligence officers to ensure that the lessons learned from the mission would be available to planners developing future air superiority operations, understanding that tactical innovations were only valuable if they could be adapted and applied by others. The human dimension of Operation Bolo remained as important as its tactical significance. Ground crews at Ubon took pride in the knowledge that their maintenance work had contributed to a mission that changed the course of the air war. Pilots throughout Southeast Asia drew confidence from the proof that American fighters could outthink as well as outfight their adversaries. The families of airmen who had been lost to MiG attacks during the previous months could take some measure of consolation from the knowledge that their sacrifices had contributed to the tactical understanding that made Operation Bolo possible. As winter turned to spring over Southeast Asia, the air war continued its relentless evolution, with both sides adapting to new realities created by the events of January 2nd and 6th. The Vietnamese People's Air Force would eventually develop countermeasures to American deception techniques, just as American planners would find new ways to exploit enemy expectations. The contest of innovation and adaptation would continue throughout the conflict, but Operation Bolo had established that tactical thinking could be as decisive as technological superiority or numerical advantage. Colonel Olds would relinquish command of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing in September 1967. but the tactical principles he had demonstrated would influence fighter operations for generations. His famous handlebar moustache became a symbol not of military rebellion, but of the kind of intellectual independence that allowed effective commanders to see beyond conventional solutions to complex tactical problems. The air war over Vietnam had proven once again that victory belonged not to the strongest or the fastest, but to those who could think most clearly under pressure and adapt most quickly to changing circumstances.